Good morning, a very, very good morning to you here at our very first breakfast edition of the Fifth Estate. It is wonderful to see you, so many of you here so early. It is a real joy to be able to introduce these two amazing women this morning. We've been trying to get them here for quite a long time, and it's a real thrill to have for, I think, the only public event in Melbourne, two of the world's foremost, experts on adoption. Deborra-lee Furness is the founder of Adoption Awareness. She's the patron of international adoption families in Queensland and the patron of Worldwide Orphans. She recently travelled with Bill Clinton, I think, to Africa. Is that right?
And he is sexy.
Is he? Fantastic.
I'm not telling my husband.
And to look at the initiatives there with orphans in Africa. She has, of course, been very widely honoured for her work in this field, and we're really fortunate to have her here today, as well as Dr Jane Aronson, who is a paediatrician, an adoption medicine specialist, founder and CEO of Worldwide Orphans. She's on the faculty at Cornell University, Columbia University, and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She's the author of a book, Carried in Our Hearts, The Gift of Adoption. Please welcome these two incredibly over-accomplished ladies. I thought we'd start, Jane, with perhaps you just painting a sort of picture for us. There's a lot of conflicting information, numbers and this sort of thing, about how many children there are, how many orphans there are, where they are, and where they're at. Where are the orphans of the world, right now?
They're everywhere, including the audience. That's a serious statement. Orphans are in our midst. Children lose their parents and always have through the centuries. So it's not something that should be hidden, and it should be owned. But for the numbers that you're interested in, there are 2.2 billion children in the world. Out of the 7 billion of us, 2.2 billion children, and about half of them live in poverty. And the numbers for UNICEF in 2009, through questionnaires, show that there are 153 million orphan children, which combines both single and double orphans under the age of 18. And likely, and more specifically, I like to talk about the fact that most orphans actually are social orphans. There are very rarely true orphans who have no parents. So it's kind of a controversial comment, but
explain what social orphans is.
Social orphan is an individual who is just not being parented by their parents. That's all it is. It's just a person, a kid, who clearly comes from a poor family, perhaps, a family where there's been disease, war, conflict, HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and the parents are either they are underemployed, undereducated, and weakened by whatever state, and they can't parent their children, and so other people may be parenting their children, lots of which is extended family. The bulk of social orphans are parented by somebody in the environment. So, but we don't have the number of children who live in institutions. That's kind of impossible, since there's probably millions of institutions all over the world, and we can't quite quantify that. The state of orphans, just to finish up your question, is that orphan children live a pretty difficult and challenging life, as you might imagine, because there's no prenatal care. A very important take-home message for all of you is that children who come from very impoverished backgrounds, their mothers do not have prenatal care. They're undernourished and malnourished during the pregnancy, so the child is born undernourished and malnourished, meaning that they're missing micronutrient deficiency and calories, and so they're growth stunted, and meaning they're small for size, and they've been damaged. They've had often organic brain injury from lack of proper nutrition during pregnancy and early childhood. So they're at risk right away for being special needs, with the things that we hear about in our own world every day: learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder with and without hyperactivity, auditory processing disorder, and behavioral health issues. But with all that, my final statement on this is that orphan children are incredibly resilient and powerful. And you'll hear Deborah and I speak about that over and over again. These are, the message for the day for me will be to tell you that they are a secret weapon. They are a resource. They're brave, they're courageous, and they need to be uplifted to a very different level of awareness so that we can meet and greet them and value them and have them become very important citizens in our midst. We need them.
The history of adoption is far longer than I realised. It's been practiced in almost every culture and civilisation as far back as we know, at least 4,000 years. But it used to be very much about succession, about an heir or property, or about community. So somebody in the village didn't have a child, give them a child. These days, the focus in Australia, with international adoption especially, is very much, and we're going to talk about this more, but about the parents, perhaps. We don't necessarily hear as much about the child. How much is a child in adoption the centre, the very centre of the story now?
To me, it is the centre of the story. What do you mean we hear about the parents in Australia wanting to adopt?
Yes.
We hear that because we see, we hear the numbers and we hear how many orphans there are in the world. And, I've told this story because Hugh and I have 2 adopted children. When I was in Australia, everyone would come up and say, we would love to adopt a child, but we can't. It's too hard. And I kept, and I know that because I went to a meeting, when we first set out to do this, we went to a meeting here just down the street, and I showed up and literally we didn't even make it to tea and cookies. I mean, it was so negative the whole way they told it. It was not supportive. It was, you had a room full of people who were putting their hand up saying, I want to love and nurture a child, and they were turned off. And, I've said this over and over. Bronwyn Bishop did the report 2005. There's an anti-adoption culture within the system, which I'll go back to as to why that is later. But go back to your original question. Sorry, I've gone off track.
About children being the centre.
Oh, being the centre. So we hear about their parents because we know that all those children are there, but these families are saying, why can't we put our hand up and do this? And they can't because of the bureaucracy, because we have a system in Australia that is like the rail gauges of the old system. All the different tracks are on different things. No state is on the same page. And so there's all different systems that you have to comply with, different rules, and it doesn't work, and we've made it arduous. The complexities, the thing I keep hearing over and over with people who've gone through the system is, we did all the paperwork, we jumped through the hoops, and then they lost our paperwork. The system is flawed. And why is that? You go back to, we have a bad attitude with it, is because of the past history with the stolen generation with the Aboriginal kids and the forgotten children, which in the 60s, 70s were the single mothers because society did not look upon them well. They were forced by state and church to give up their kids.
Do you think that is the primary reason?
That we have a bad attitude? Yes. And those women have suffered ongoing, because they weren't given support services. They have myopically suffered ongoing, so they view adoption as barbaric because of their suffering.
I wanted to take two points in this, and that is, number one, I want to talk a little bit about how international adoption is in a terrible state. In the 25 plus years that I've been doing international adoption medicine, we've watched countries open and close, and it's related to what you were just talking about, which is really about keeping the system transparent. There is some good to the bureaucracy. I want to make sure that everyone knows, finally, at the end of the day. We're not saying
no accountability, of course.
Transparency, fighting trafficking. But what ends up happening with the system is that people just get so caught up in the possibility of there being some immoral moment that then the system just gets stuck.
And I think governments get scared. They get a whiff of some sort of corruption, they're out of there, which has just happened recently because we closed our Ethiopian program.
Right, well.
And I know a family that were in that program for 10 years. 10 years they had jumped through the hoops. And the stories I heard one woman, they made her renovate her house because it was not childproof. This was like year 2 of the process. So she's renovated. And ongoing, but 10 years, and then they were cut off, and therefore that meant that system closed down. So they were in that program. They had to go back to the beginning and start with a Vietnamese or another program.
the other little piece I wanted to speak to was the fact that, I mean, if you drill down about adoption, you get back to what you said, Sally, about, the history of adoption, and that it's about, a lot of it has to do with foreign. When you took a child into your home, this was a foreign child, in essence. It could have been a child from war, conflict, where the family was killed, and then you had to take another ethnic group into your home. Like what's happening in Rwanda after the genocide. That's required, that people take a child into their home to help these kids who've lost their families. But that piece is important for all of us to remember, because there's really a hookup to our human nature, that we have a very hard time liking one another. And then we see the foreignness of others. So any difference causes us to be, it's an irksome moment. And that really becomes a very deeply ingrained behavior in adoption, because it's other. You're taking, in fact, when you look at the data in the United States, I can only speak to that there's data looking at what happens when a couple comes in for counseling for adoption. And typically, you'll face that men more commonly are not eager, as a woman is eager to adopt, because a man will see the adoption as non-self. And that really speaks to
it's a great spiritual lesson, because it's a lie.
It's
that's why adoption to me was so beautiful. I have 2 children through adoption, 2 boys from Vietnam and Ethiopia. And what I love,
you both just had their bar mitzvah,
right? They're Jewish boys.
Mazel tov.
But the why I love adoption so much, and not just because I'm an adoption doctor, is I love the non-self. I love that my children don't look like me. I make fun. It's a beautiful event to sort of see them grow and turn into these lovely young men, and they just aren't me, and I'm so congratulatory to them. They can put spoons on their noses. I can't.
There are lots of parts of an adoption process. It's something you need to be thick-skinned, but also open heart and enlightened to some degree.
But that's your key. That's your education. That's the big key. Yeah. And that's why Dr. Purvis is giving a lecture after this. She speaks to that piece of the emotion. Any child that comes from foster care or adoption comes from something having gone wrong, comes from a disconnect, comes from pain. And therefore, a child that has travelled this journey needs to be parented in a different way. And you need to educate the families that are taking on this child, that they have to be given the tools and the skills to interpret what the behaviour is.
You have to be, in a sense, excuse me for saying this, to really adopt and take in a child and love a child who's from someone else like that. You have to be pretty generous and very educated, actually. And when you're not, then you're not going to be able to deal with this piece.
Yeah. So it's education.
I want to get back just for a moment to to get back into the reasons for the Australian situation and the forgotten
it's generation. It's going to change by next year, by the way.
So I want to jump to that, but we'll wait. I wonder too, though, and you've just talked about some of the deeper kind of reasons, Jane, about the way different people feel about bringing other into their homes and so on. We know in certain parts of the world, I've spent a lot of time in India, that infertility is always the woman's fault. There can be no greater burden, really, for an Indian woman than to not be able to have a child. Yeah. But I wonder too, when I see the attitude in Australia towards IVF, towards adoption, whether in fact this is a more general cultural loathing, almost. Absolutely. A disdain for women in particular, but also couples that can't have their own children, and they're put to the very bottom of the heap. That one of the really practical reasons why these things are so difficult is because there's no votes in it.
That's the thing, and children can't vote, so it's not a...
Well, there's terrible pain, though, finally, at the end of the day, when people realise that they've lived all their lives to create that life cycle, to partner and to then have a family. And when you then look around and see millions of children born without much thought, and then you're thoughtfully considering having a family and you can't procreate. I spent a lot of time with social workers and psychologists working with families for many years before I really got steeped in international adoption, worked with families who really had to face those psychological issues and sense of, talk about loss, not being able to have a family that you want. And that takes a lot of work. But that's the thing.
You've got the kids. It goes back to you've got the kids that need a family and the families that want to parent them. This is my big piece. I'm like, come on, let's get them together, get out of the way, and make it work. So it works. And you talk about the IVF. I was horrified when I heard that you can't be on the adoption waiting list and be going through IVF at the same time. And I was like, why not? And I mean, surely you're a grown-up. If you did get pregnant IVF and you didn't choose to go ahead, there's plenty of people waiting behind you. I thought that was outrageous, and I don't know if it's still in Victoria.
Well, I mean,
it is still in Victoria.
It's right in the United States. It was for the long time. You had to keep
what
that
is the
secret.
reasoning behind it?
Well, in Queensland, you need a certain BMI.
Body mass index.
The same for adoption in Korea, though. You can't
And yet, in most of our prisons in Australia, you could be a murderer and have a conjugal visit that won't be checked.
We know what that's all about.
No one will give you IVF in Victoria, there's a police background check.
Wow.
So it's partly what I was getting at in that last question, that they're a different group. The infertile or the childless are othered as almost as much as orphan children. I think there's some connection in that other.
Well, it goes back to education again and changing that attitude. It's just ignorance.
So tell us, Deb, 2005, Bronwyn Bishop did her report. It was very clear what her findings. She found a disdain, an anti-adoption culture. That report had some very clear, practical suggestions,
which we're asking to be implemented,
about untangling government and about including NGOs, all sorts of things.
Great ideas.
What has been implemented?
Very little. Well,
and what are we going to hear? What's tomorrow?
Okay. And I kept saying that too, and they say, "Oh, this has been implemented." And it's like you have to read the political talk, which is, I don't know, they moved something to the third drawer. I couldn't understand what they'd done. It's like little baby steps. But we've just asked for this. Okay, our big news is with Adoption Awareness Week that James Packer has just backed us and given us money to write policy, which is pretty impressive. So we're getting our team on. We had a big dinner. We had a meeting here last night. And this is sort of the first time. When I first started doing this, I was like, why isn't everyone on the same page and no unity? In adoption, it was like everyone was disparate. The Vietnamese mothers didn't talk to the Korean mothers, and this support group didn't. Everyone was all over the shop, and I was like, it needs unity. I was thrilled last night. We got together with about 15 CEOs of child advocacy groups who'd never really talked to each other, and everyone went around the table and said what their piece was. And everyone was like, oh, yeah, well, I can do that, and I can do that. And it was like, it was amazing. Fantastic. And then last night there was these two scholars who have been doing research, and that was their chosen topic. So they're now working with our policy person. Anyway, we are writing the policy, and then yesterday at the press conference in Sydney, Prue Goward is the minister in Sydney, who's already trying to implement legislation for foster to adopt, leaned over to me after she'd seen our presentation, and she said, we're going to do this. We're going to meet with me during the week. And I looked at my schedule. I was like, can we Google chat? I was like, I've got to make this happen. But she is on board. If we can get one minister to do a template to take to Tony Abbott and get all the states on, and there's just the feeling, I'm very optimistic, but there is a feeling at the moment this year that there is going to be shift. And now that we're resourced to do the work, and every time I go on a radio show, I talk about this, people who are not even in adoption, it's not about adoption, it's about the kids. You can't be aware that there's a 2-year-old sitting on the street, that's the visual if you put it down, sitting there by themselves, and you're just going to walk past. I'm saying this has to be huge. Everyone has to put their hand up and say, I want to do something about this. And also we're doing a huge global campaign to go to the UN next year.
Is there a minister or a department that is, you will target that you think should be in charge of this?
Well, I like Bronwyn Bishop. She's Speaker of the House now, so I don't know how that works.
Not
but I'll
great.
talk to her anyway.
Yeah, but she can let them, I suppose, keep speaking if it comes up before the Parliament.
Exactly. She can just keep talking. Well, obviously Tony Abbott. We've got a new child commissioner, Megan Mitchell. She's out of the country at the moment. We're doing the press gallery in Canberra on Wednesday. And politics is not my area. I believe everyone, so I don't do well in that world. Oh, but he said. Anyway, so we've got smart people that can strategize that. But we're looking for a champion. We should put it down on paper, a job applicant for champion of this in Australia.
Jane, I think from Australia there's a sort of a bit of a perception that Australia is one of the very worst countries at this.
It's not a perception.
It's not a perception.
Oh, it's true.
Well, and that America is one of the best. And part of the reason is that you see, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt can trot off to any continent they like and pick up another beautiful child and increase their brood, and so can, anybody really that's got the spotlight, I suppose. That's in Australia, that's what you see. That somehow
that's
this
not
is
real.
Well, and you know that she's their doctor too.
Yeah, no, that's not real.
How does it happen then? How are they able to do this?
I think if you look at the history of orphans, foster care, and adoption in the United States, you'd open your eyes wide. And I'm not going to get into a long dissertation about it, but we were derelict in our duties and responsibilities for hundreds of years. All the years that we've been a republic, we've been bad. And you're no one's worse than anyone else.
No, but we have the lowest numbers.
That's only because you have it's just probably some of the idiosyncratic anthropology of your country. Started by prisoners, you're 200 years, all that kind of stuff you can fill in and make a story. I'm sure there's some scholars in
I'll
the
produce
place.
the movie.
There you go. It's a small country, mostly white people, that kind of thing.
But who does it the best? Sweden and the Netherlands and South Korea, right?
Yep. South Korea's gold standard. But, when you analyze all of this, I think what we need to come to is you need to understand that in the United States, we had a long, long history of orphanages, thousands of orphanages all over the world, all over our country. And kids were stuck in those places and they died of broken hearts and they had, very poor care. And even when we poured money into those orphanages, which was very common in many of the cities, there's lots of Jewish philanthropy that tried to change the way orphanages were. Nothing changed, by the way. You can't pour money into an orphanage and change it. It's not how it works. Kids don't have love. They don't have good training, caregivers. There's no professional sort of goals in an orphanage setting. They're crowded.
Tell us what happens to kids when they're in the developmental stuff.
Well, the truth of the matter is that when children are living in institutionalized settings and they're poorly nourished and not paid attention to and they're not attaching, they end up losing a month of development for every 3 months they're in the institution. So if you have a 12-month-old child, you're going to end up with an 8 or 9-month-old child, 8 or 9 months developmentally for that child. And that continues, obviously, to increase over time. But orphanages are really crazy and horrible places when there's no attention to the psychosocial issues of children and the nutritional issues of children. I work in a world, Worldwide Orphans Foundation, I'm an adoption advocate for sure, but Worldwide Orphans is an organization that really came about because of the need to transition and deal with the acute issues of institutionalized children. I realized that kids in institutions were losing ground and were failing to thrive and were miserable and depressed and sick. And when I traveled all over the world and saw all of that, I decided to create this foundation which would go in and do professional training and enrichment in the orphanage, and we do all the things that you might imagine. We are involved and engaged in education, access to medical care, and psychological and emotional developmental support. And that's not the answer, by the way, but at least it's at least a beginning.
It's a panacea.
It's not a panacea for sure, those children, and we're part of that. We're part of taking orphanages apart. Get rid of them. Move kids back to the community. We do all of that, preventing orphaning and or reintegrating and reuniting families because of what I told you about social orphaning.
But that's a big piece to me, that attachment piece, which and I've been educated about the local situation. Like we talk about, there's 18,000 kids in foster care in Australia. 70. These are the 18,000 that are ready for a home. That means they've been permanently removed. So they could have a thing of permanency. 70 of those were adopted last year. From 18,000, there's an average of 6 placements. So these kids go. Imagine you go from family to family and you don't know. And our youth ambassador's mother said she was with us this week. She says, I never realised. She said she fostered 29 kids, and every one of those kids said, "Can I please stay?" And she had to look in their face and go, I don't know.
So
because
why?
the system sent them back sometimes to the abuse that they came from. So the carers, the foster parents, are nurturing them back to a healing and then sending them back. And what is interesting is the emotional piece is the damage. These children, the attachment stuff, that's just like I can look at you and smile and we know how to connect. These kids, that it becomes a disconnect. They're isolated, and they're the people you see out in the streets. You know,
criminality, prostitution.
Well, criminality and all the horrific tales. But they lose that skill. That's like taking your life away. It's tragic.
Jane, you said South Korea's the gold standard.
Yeah,
Why is that?
What happened is, these are all these wonderful historical stories that you can look up and Google, and you'll be absolutely mesmerized by it. But the Korean conflict in the early 50s led two lovely individuals, Harry and Bertha Holt, who lived in Oregon. They were farmers, they had birth children, and they felt the plight of Amerasian children. They, in their hearts, felt that those children that would be the results of fraternization between American soldiers and Korean women would lead to the development of a large population of Amerasian children who would be rejected by Koreans and rejected by us as Americans. And so what they did is they petitioned the American government to create a system that would allow those children to become American citizens. And from that came a hugely successful adoption system where children were sent to many different countries, not just to the United States. And in the beginning, they all came from orphanages, and many of those children were adopted at 3, 4, and 5 years and older. But gradually, the system evolved into a very, very elegant and professionalized system of foster care, where women went to birthing centers, got prenatal care. It was well advertised on billboards in all cities. Young women could, get pregnant, at a karaoke bar. You read about it, and the medicals are elegant and beautiful. I love them. And then they would end up, this young man wouldn't be in their life anymore, and they didn't want to keep the baby, and they had dysfunctional families with lots of divorce and alcoholism, all like a soap opera back in the United States. And so what ended up happening, these babies would end up going into foster care, professionally trained foster care parents who were in their middle age with grown children, and they would take a foster baby in, and the babies were adopted between 3 and 6 months of age. And that system really evolved into a system that was really magnificent and a role model for all of us around the world. Although it's gone under tremendous changes, but the eventual goal, to take a look at this, was that the system would go domestic. So the large numbers of children that were adopted from Korea and that went maybe off to Sweden or the United States or other Western European countries, those children, 4,000, 5,000 a year, became less than 1,000 in the last couple of years because Korean citizens are adopting babies. Mostly boy babies, by the way, preference for boy children and infants. And then what happens is, unfortunately, any child that doesn't get adopted is waiting in the system now. So a lot of my experience now in America for adoption is toddler adoption. And this goes back to what Deborah meant, and that was mentioned that the, attachment. If you don't get a baby out of an institutionalized setting, this baby's heart is broken. And these babies now that came out of Korea, they were so perfect little babies, getting a family quickly in the first few months of life. Now they're waiting till I'm taking care of families who are adopting kids that are 2. And those kids are really keening. You know the expression keening? Mm. They come keening, mourning and grieving because they've been in care and then lose that foster family.
And that's what makes me crazy, that the system, because of all our paperwork, that really matters. Every minute matters.
Well, the average in Australia now is somewhere between 3 and 10 years. So you're talking about people applying to adopt babies for babies that are not only not born, but
exactly.
are not even, the mothers of some of these children may be still children themselves. Yeah. It's the amount of time. I think everyone would understand that there's a lot of work, a lot of important work that needs to be done to make sure a child should be released expediently.
Yeah,
but it takes 9 months for a woman to grow a human. I mean, that to me
that's an impressive
seems
job.
Rather more complicated.
Yeah.
So why is it? Why this long?
That's what started me out in this. Why? And I think we just got to keep asking why. And someone's going to. We're all about making it happen.
I think you have to talk to the crowd and tell them now that really what's most important is not so much about why. We could talk about why. It's very philosophical. It's psychological. I like to do that.
I like
it's fun.
philosophical.
I know, it's fun. we already did it. We're done. We know that people just have people are neurotic. So the bottom line, though, is when you stand before this crowd and you sit here and we talk about this, what's the call to action? That's the phrase that we're sort of...
We're all about call to action. Why do something?
We want to conscript you into an army.
And that's why I keep saying this here. I said we need allies. We need everyone can play a part. So we're saying everyone can have an idea of how do you contribute. And a big thing is it's not just about adoption. You know, it's about the kids. I mean, we're adoption awareness. That is one small part of the puzzle. Like Jane's work, she works within country. But that's what we're saying. Everyone can play a part. And how do you serve a child that is alone? Maybe they can't be adopted. And I keep going back, initiatives that you go to the systemic core. Why there are so many children that are abandoned is because of lack of education or family planning for these young girls in these third world countries. They're not given any choice. So they're giving up this child. They don't know what their choices are. So it's very holistic how we want to approach this. Because really, it's a demographic you want to go down. You don't want there to be children.
Right. It's a global issue.
It is.
We're not taking responsibility in the community. And I've been in 14 countries working, and now I'm in 5 countries. And I do believe that the talk about systemic change. The change that has to occur is that we all as individuals have to take responsibility. I see my life as a life of destiny, and I believe that everyone can share a teeny piece of this destiny to take responsibility in the community for making sure that children are revered. Karen Purvis, who you'll get to know hopefully, sees children as precious. They're precious in the world, and we're not seeing them as precious.
We're not seeing that, exactly.
We're in denial. We just don't want to face the humongous issues that face us as a planet about children, and we have to take it by the balls right now and do it.
So we're just saying, everyone, we're trying to get, if we get enough people signing a petition, that means that we're going to tell our leaders that this is a priority, that kids are a priority. And it's literally, the possibilities are endless. Even if you took responsibility for one child, or you mentored a foster child on a Saturday afternoon, I mean, that's just an example. There is just endless, it's a huge well of creativity. Well, if everyone just took that away and said, what am I going to do today to make a difference in one child's life?
But the final thing is going to be when you make that policy, when you create that policy in the next year or so.
Next year.
They keep on saying a year. I'm thinking to myself, I know the legislation that went on.
I like to give myself
between
pressure.
1992 and 2000, when Clinton was president, we changed adoption and foster care completely. He was amazing. And we shortened the time the kids get stuck. And we really took responsibility, and that really changed the numbers of children in foster care and increased the numbers of forced to adopt. What we need to do now is to understand that Deborah's organization is going to really do the policy piece, and laws will be made. And you're the voters. That's what we need. You're the voters.
Right, to your local member.
Right. Yeah. You're going to get engaged in a grassroots effort to change this country. We talked about it last night, and it's going to happen very quickly, by the way. The time is right. Don't let it go. It's your time to change your country. And you have the opportunity to do it in the grassroots level. Yeah. And that's what adoption awareness is going to be all about. They're going to get a lot of money. There's a huge amount of money that's flowing in. I have charity envy.
Last night at dinner, our local, the Pratt Foundation, who has backed us in advocacy for the last few years, just topped up their thing, so they're now our $1 million donor. How impressive is that?
Yeah. Yep.
Exactly. Go the Pratt Foundation.
I think it's very impressive to get the Pratts and the Packers. I
got a few connections.
But I'm going to turn it over in a minute to audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up and somebody will hopefully put a microphone in it. But I wanted to mention a news story I saw. It was so extraordinary. Now I wonder if I was dreaming, because it was sort of early morning. But a few months ago, on a Pakistani game show, which was a bit sort of like the new Price is Right kind of game show, during Ramadan, the host of this show, who's a very famous Pakistan celebrity, gave away an orphaned baby on live television to an infertile couple who had failed at IVF and had lost all hope of having a child. They weren't expecting it. They didn't know it was going to happen. And it caused an incredible uproar.
It should have been caused an incredible uproar.
It was
because the message is clear. You can't be giving away children, and you can't. I mean, the process of adoption. I mean, it's just such a crazy story. I mean, it circulated in the United States. It was wild. We all went crazy because as much as it's a really wonderful moment in a way, ideally speaking, that a baby becomes,
a commodity.
Lucky to be with a family. The baby was a commodity. The baby was sold on TV in a way, and no home study, and no education and preparation for being a parent. It's disgusting, and it just shows you again the attitude about the baby. Where is the respect for this life? Where is this precious life going? So, bad moment.
It was extraordinary. As I say, I sort of still can't believe whether I actually saw it. So I clearly
we just had a scandal where we had babies that had been adopted and then the parents decided to dissolve the adoption on their own and plan
on the web.
On the web.
Send them.
Home adoption.
Advertise them.
Just advertise them, and it was going on all over the place, and it's gone on for a long time. Now, it's not that it's sort of, some people said, well, don't get so excited. It's like kinship foster care. Or kinship, where parents and families decide that if they can't take care of their kids, then someone in the family takes the kid. So it's a little bit different. The internet shouldn't be a part of adoption.
No.
Any questions? Yeah.
Is that on? Good morning. Morning, Jane, Deborah. I'm Colleen Clare from the Victorian Post-Adoption Network, and I wondered if you could discuss for a moment we've got 18,000 children in Australia in foster care. So I'm interested in their position related to why we would look at inter-country adoption when we've got that position. And I wondered if you could discuss a bit in the context of the child's need to have a transparent connection to the birth mum and dad, to country and culture. And I know you both know a lot about the experience of adopted children.
So we met last night. How are you?
We did.
Colleen joined our meeting last night.
Thank you so much.
So it's a great question. Deb, do you want to go first because it's on the Australian...
Just let me understand, you say comparing the local to the inter-country. I don't understand what you're...
I'm interested about the perspective.
Why when we've got...
18,000 children.
Why would you adopt internationally? I like that one. You give yours.
I'll repeat it.
Because they can't be adopted.
But you're talking about policy change and making a strategic move. So my question is, why would you focus also on inter-country adoption?
I don't care if a child comes from Parramatta or Peru.
Well, but
when we know from the work with adopted children that it matters to them how connected they are to birth parents, to country and culture.
That's the ideal. And adoptive parents take that culture. If you do adopt a child from another culture, obviously you have to be very aware and sensitive to that and incorporate that in the child's growth. And if possible, we always ask for best practices, if possible, to stay holistically connected to birth families if possible in an ideal world. Also, in the foster system, you have a lot of children that are older, and not every family is going to put their hand up to parent an older child. A lot of families do. They know that that's what they want is a baby, and there is not a lot of babies, thankfully, in Australia that are available for adoption, which is why inter-country started, because these kids weren't able to be adopted.
At the moment, would it be easy, if you were starting out on wanting to adopt a child, if you're Australian, are you likely to have a successful outcome if you went down the domestic path or the international path?
International, that's why international became so popular.
Still, it's even with all those restrictions.
And then we've got to get better at that too. When a baby is born in Australia, again, they're waiting too long before there's permanency. They've got to have an assessment process that establishes whether that family is not able to parent that child, and as fast as possible get that child into a permanent family.
I want to comment on the interracial piece.
That's a big...
I think that we can't... it's complicated. I mean, I'm a white girl, and I have two boys who are not of my race. So I'm really aware, and as an adoption doctor, I've been aware. I've spent all these years helping and guiding families bring children of different races into their homes. And I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. got to be honest about that, because I think
there's no tried and true. It's every individual case, and that's what we did in the past. I know I've spoken to many Asian adoptees that came from Vietnam from the airlift that were taken to Wagga and grew up with, you know, Tom and Brian, who've got red hair and freckles, and they look in the mirror and see this Asian person. They don't recognise that person because we didn't education. We didn't when we took them from country, and maybe that was a better scenario. They might have been dead. I don't know what the situation was, but we need the education to support them and understand that piece. And this is all the post exactly.
Well, that's
what I've been saying this for years since I started speaking. You cannot do. It has to be holistic. The post-adoptive piece is so imperative.
Right, but I think the folks here are probably not as equipped educationally to understand that adoption actually follows a very interesting developmental map through the ages of a child. And it's really important that as you grow here in your interest in adoption, that you begin to look at identity issues. I think that's really important. It's really key that if you're going to be helping Deborah and really learning and then voting, that you should become very steeped in the developmental issues of adoption identity. It's key, it's important, you can't ignore it. People deal with it differently, and it requires a tremendous amount of sensitivity and real, it's otherworldly in that you have to get rid of your fear of difference. And I made a joke about it the other day, just before. I made that one joke about what I do with my kids. But, you know, you just don't know which direction your children are going to go in on this score, and you have to be very open for rejection.
Even your biological child.
Well, that's it, isn't it? That's a universal.
Yeah.
One more question.
Hi, my name's Penny Mackison. I'm an adoptee myself. I've worked in child protection here in Victoria. I've worked in intercountry adoption.
This is the kind of question
I'm interested that we've spent the morning talking about adoption and intercountry adoption in particular without having mentioned the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption.
That was on purpose.
Yeah, that's a big kahuna.
But go ahead, tell us what you're thinking.
Well, in the context also of Deborah's comments about Australia being anti-adoption, I'm interested in that. I'm interested that you think that the bureaucracy here is anti-adoption. I find that very difficult as somebody who's worked in the field, as well as being an adoptee myself, to hear that, because in Australia I think everybody in the field feels that we're implementing the legislation that's been established and the Hague Convention to the best of our ability, and what you see as bureaucracy and red tape is actually about us ensuring that people who put up their hand to adopt are suitable. Not everybody who puts up their hand
That's a good point.
is suitable, even after...
I couldn't agree more.
Even after lots of education, lots of support, lots of assistance. A lot of people don't resolve their own grief about not being able to have a biological child. And in fact, all that bureaucracy, as you call it, and all that red tape is about making sure people are going to be suitable.
I'll have to let them respond because we have to wind it up, but it's a really important point.
It's very important, but
it's also to respond.
I hear you, but it's not me that said it was anti. It was an inquiry. It was an inquiry that Bronwyn Bishop did that uncovered this. So it's not me saying this. She did the work. She said that there was a pervasive feeling of anti-adoption within the system. And it's not me saying that the process, I am all over it. You have to do due diligence and you have to make sure that the parents have known. I couldn't agree more. And I'm speaking from what I'm getting from all the people that are going through the process. And they have said to me that it's not serving. The fact that you said it's due diligence, people who have jumped through the hoops that tell me that then they say we've lost your paperwork several times, or that they're asked they're asked to jump through hoops that are not necessary.
But we always do our different thing here. Let me just...
But I hear you and I hear the due diligence, but I'm not saying this. This has been done.
Right.
The work's been done to say this.
But I think the important piece here is that we're going to have in any audience, we're going to have the triad. We're going to have an adoptee. We're going to have a birth mother. We're going to have adoptive parents.
And everyone has to be heard.
And we can't be contentious. We have to really... This is the moment. And I've seen this in my own country. It's a time for us to be together and to try to bring our gifts and skills to the table to make it work for the children. It's really important that we hear each other.
We have to wind it up. I'm so sorry we don't have more time, particularly for questions. It's gone so fast, but I'm sure there are some people here that have to be at work by 9 o'clock, and I've got a funny feeling you have to be somewhere as well. It has been just wonderful to have you both here. I feel really enlightened by the conversation, and I'd like to thank you both so very, very much. Deborra-lee Furness and Dr Jane Aronson, please give them a very warm thank you.
Thank you.
And just for any Fifth Estate regulars that are here, it is the last, it's a funny old week, it's usually Tuesday evenings, but our last Fifth Estate for the year will actually be this Thursday evening, usual time, 6:15, but at the Melbourne Conference Centre, because we have, I think, the only public appearance in Melbourne of the UK editor of The Guardian. It should be a really interesting conversation, along with the editor-in-chief of the New Guardian Australia. So that's this Thursday. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.